Good afternoon. It's great to see you all. I'm Elizabeth Allison. I'm a professor in philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness. I'm also the founding chair of the program in ecology, spirituality, and religion here at CIS. So I have these dual roles. And today I want to talk to you about, within this vast space of philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness, these big, big concepts, I want to talk to you about a couple little particular corners. The corner of philosophy and consciousness, where worldviews are expressed in spiritualities and religions. Worldviews can be expressed in a lot of ways in Jungian psychology too, but where worldviews are expressed in religions and spiritualities, I see that as a subset of philosophy and consciousness. And then the corner of cosmology is ecology. Thomas Berry said, ecology is functional cosmology. It's cosmology that is applied in daily life. So I did that framing to sort of show you where my field of religion and ecology fits into this vast universe of philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness. And to give you a sense maybe of how the ecology, spirituality, and religion program grew out of PCC. I'll talk about that a little bit later. And these intersections of the growing field of religion and ecology, which has been developing for the last 40 years or so, with philosophy and cosmology and consciousness. And there are tremendous intersections of these fields. I mean, in a way, I don't think religion and ecology would exist without PCC, right? There have been so many scholars, some of whom I'll talk about today, who have had connections with PCC, and PCC keeps contributing to this field. So I want to give you a sense of religion and ecology as a field, where it's come from, some of the streams that have led into it, why I think it's important at this moment. And every time I say why it's important at this moment, I have a million reasons. Each year I have more and more reasons why it's important at this moment. And so I'll talk a little bit more about why at this exact moment I feel like religion and ecology is really crucial. And then I want to talk about some of the latest developments in the field, some of the cutting edges where religion and ecology has been, and where I see the leading edges of theory and research and analysis. This semester I'm on sabbatical, and so I'm not teaching, and I'm working on a bunch of writing projects, and I feel like they're all at this cutting edge, and I'm super excited about all of them. So I'll talk about some of that towards the end. And I actually have 2 new articles out in the last 2 weeks that I'll get shared to you. So I feel like a lot of creativity right now when I've taken my attention away from the daily preparation of teaching and just trying to really unpack these ideas in religion and ecology that I've been studying for a decade and a half and develop them into projects. So I'll say more about that later on. So you're probably familiar with Thomas Berry, but I'm not going to assume that everybody is. He called himself a geologian. He was a theologian and a historian of religions at Fordham University for many years. Chaired the History of Religions program at Fordham University. He passed away in 2009. But he wrote many books that have been influential in creating this field of religion and ecology, and also in creating PCC. He worked together with Brian Swimme, writing The Universe Story, the subtitle of which is From the Primordial Flaring Forth to the Ecozoic Era. And he was trying to describe what he saw as an ecozoic era that we need. And I'll talk a little bit more about what he meant by that. Thomas Berry was an important mentor, not only to Brian Swimme, mentor and collaborator with Brian Swimme, but also to Mary Evelyn Tucker and John Grimm, who are now at Yale directing the Forum on Religion and Ecology. And I'll say more about the Forum on Religion and Ecology too, because it's an important partner with us here in PCC and Ecology, Spirituality, and Religion. Mary Evelyn Tucker is an important mentor to me. She was on my dissertation committee. She still is a great person for guidance and support. So right there is a little bit of a lineage. And Mary Evelyn Tucker edited Thomas Berry's book Evening Thoughts that came out posthumously. She worked together with Brian Swim, our own Brian Swim, to create the Journey of the Universe film book project and curriculum that some of you might be aware of. Anyone familiar with that? Yeah, okay, great. And if you haven't seen it, make sure you see it. It's thrilling. So Thomas Berry is an important progenitor of PCC and also ESR. And in his book, The Great Work, Our Way into the Future, Berry said that universities need to undergo a transformation. And I think this is so applicable to PCC and to starting a new course of study and being here. He said they need to incorporate a functional understanding of ecology into all programs and coursework. And I have to say, in the landscape of higher ed, we're actually seeing something totally different. We're seeing much more movement towards a technocratic, business-centered, tech-centered approach. But Thomas Berry said, really what we need is this holistic understanding of ecology woven through all of our programs. And I'll quote him here. He said, "The difficulty cannot be resolved simply by establishing a course or a program in ecology, for ecology is not a course or a program. Rather, it is the foundation of all courses, all programs, and all professions, because ecology is functional cosmology, as I said earlier. Ecology is not part of medicine. Medicine is an extension of ecology, as you said, Michael, in a certain way. Ecology is not part of law. Law is an extension of ecology, as my husband will say. So too, in their own way, the same can be said of economics and even the humanities. The new situation, that is environmental crisis, requires that the university find its primary concern in a functional cosmology. So you're here to study cosmology. That's perfect, functional cosmology. Such functional cosmology can exist, however, only within a university where the spirit dimension of the universe, as well as its physical dimension, is recognized. So guess what? You're totally in the right place. We're not across the bay at UC Berkeley where there's there's no spiritual dimension of the universe, of the earth. We're here at CIS where we can recognize, talk about, and explore that, which I think is just a tremendous privilege. And of course we have in our faculty of PCC one of the leading cosmologists who understands the universe as having a spiritual or interior dimension. We have the great study of astrology, which looks at that from another angle. We have integral ecology. We have Steiner. All of these ways of looking at interior aspects of the universe and of the earth, of functional cosmology. Berry further elaborates the dire situation of planetary life at this juncture, when humanity has completely changed the face of the earth and potentially portending grave challenges ahead, which I'll talk about some more. He says we need to make a huge change as humanity and make a conscious transition into the ecozoic era, in which humans live in a mutually enhancing relationship with the earth and earth community. And so that's the tagline of PCC, right? Moving towards a mutually enhancing relationship with the earth and earth community. We want humanity to be a beneficial force on the earth. We don't want to adopt that very tired environmentalist perspective that says humanity is like a cancer on the earth. Like, we're not. We're here for some reason that may be unknown to us, but to use these capacities of creativity and innovation and art and music and philosophy to do something. So we're not a cancer on the earth, but we need to find out in a positive way what that something is. Berry says that something is to bring about the ecozoic era, this mutually enhancing relationship on the earth community. So then, well, what's the ecozoic era? Well, fortunately, a student of Brian Swim's, Allison Kiplinger, who graduated from PCC in 2004, wrote a really nice essay unpacking this. And she called it Groping Our Way Toward a New Geologic Era, a study of the word ecozoic. Because I've always been a little puzzled by, what exactly is the ecozoic? So she says, I'm quoting Allison now, The etymology of ecozoic is eco, derived from the Greek word oikos, meaning house, household, or home. You're probably familiar with ecology, oikos, the study of home. And zoic, from the Greek word zoikos, meaning pertaining to living beings. So thus, the ecozoic era is defined as the era of the house of living beings. So we want to all be part of this house of living beings, not only humanity. And I think that Allison wrote this quite a while ago, but since she wrote this, there's been an increasing tendency to use, rather than the term ecozoic, the term Anthropocene. You've heard, yeah. And there's been quite a lot of critique from humanistic perspectives, feminist, philosophical perspectives, ethical perspectives, saying that this idea of Anthropocene inappropriately elevates the anthropos, the human. And do we really want to name this era or epoch after the force that appears to be destroying the earth? And other questions have been raised in terms of, well, who is that anthropos? It's not actually everybody who's contributing to the changing face of the earth. Certain groups of people are contributing much more than others to the changing face of the earth. I mean, clue, mostly people like us, mostly people inhabiting major metropolitan areas, living in the US, being able to consume a lot of the world's resources. Those are the people who are mostly changing the face of the earth. So it might not be the people in the jungle of the Amazon as much. And then a feminist critique has been, it seems to be naming it the age of man, and doesn't that leave out a lot of people? So are these really the best ways to rename what appears to be a qualitatively different geologic age that we're embarking upon? There's been a lot of discussion. And so I think that Thomas Berry's Ecozoic is such a refreshing response to that, to not name the geologic age after just one group, but to name it after the household of life on Earth. That's what he's seeking. And so then Allison, interviewed Brian Swimme and asked, how did you come up with this idea of Ecozoic anyway? And so she writes, this is what Brian said. When Thomas and I, this is Brian speaking, when Thomas and I were writing the universe story, this would have been in the late 1980s, we wanted to get the right name for the emerging era. We went round and round and round trying out possibilities. This was when we were working in motels or eating meals in restaurants or talking on the phone in between meetings. And he says, then one night, I don't know the exact date, the phone rang and I answered it. And it was Thomas. He didn't say hello or anything. He just launched right into it. His voice was explosive with excitement. I've got it! It's the Ecozoic era! We both burst out with laughter, our instant mutual recognition of just how right this term was. It was the first time the word was ever thought of. It's an example of Thomas's geological consciousness. That's Brian talking about Thomas Berry. So that's Brian's memory of how this term was developed. And I love the way that it just kind of came through Thomas Berry as an inspiration of what the new geologic period should be called. But I think that it's really important to have this in our mind, because if we have in our mind that we're living in the age, the Anthropocene, the age of humans or the age of man, versus if we have in our mind we're living in the age of the household of life on Earth, it's just a really different whole worldview, whole orientation that we have. So I wanted to bring this forward. I think this is such an important contribution. And as I mentioned already, Berry says that this has to happen in a certain kind of university, that one where both the physical and spiritual dimensions of the universe can be observed and analyzed and comprehended. So this is the place that we can do that. So I have another quote from Berry that's basically what I just said. He says, the transformation of human life indicated in this transition from the Cenozoic to the Ecozoic era affects our sense of reality and values at such a profound level, it can only be compared to the great classical religious movements of the past. It affects our perceptions of the origin and meaning of existence itself. It might possibly be considered a meta-religious movement, since it involves not only a single segment of the human community, but the entire human community. Even beyond the human order, the entire geobiological order of the planet is involved. So he's trying to get us to take a really broad view in which we can embrace the entire human community as well as the entire community of life on Earth. And I think that that's a tremendous paradigm shift that we haven't fully absorbed. He was writing 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago, and I don't feel like that's fully made it into consciousness on a larger scale. But this is the place where we can start to work on that. So he says the universities must decide whether they will continue training persons for temporary survival in the declining Cenozoic era, or whether they will begin educating students for the emerging Ecozoic. And this is what we're trying to do here. So I said, when I think of this, I always say, well, it's so important right now. It's right now. And, in the last couple of weeks, we've seen just an unprecedented level of so-called natural disasters here and around the world. And, again, I was just like, okay, well, I'm doing this intro to PCC lecture. It's so timely. It's so timely because this thing just happened. But every year there's something that has just happened. So just in case you haven't been paying attention to the news, let me get all my details right here. Okay, so we've had 4 incredibly strong hurricanes that have battered the Caribbean, Mexico, Puerto Rico, southern United States. Hurricane Irma was the most powerful storm ever recorded in the Atlantic Ocean. On Barbuda, 90% of all structures were destroyed. The Prime Minister declared Barbuda practically uninhabitable. We don't even know what's going on in Puerto Rico right now because the electricity is out and there have been very few communications. Houston's trying to recover. Houston is the 4th largest city in the US. Houston's trying to recover from Hurricane Harvey. Harvey was the largest rainstorm event ever recorded in US history, 51 inches of rain in some places. So, you could just have your focus on the Caribbean, on the southern US, like, wow, weather is really weird over here. But you could also turn your focus to the north, right? And there were huge wildfires throughout Washington, Oregon, Canada, Northern California, down in LA. There was, wait, did I miss anything there? Oh yeah, the fire jumped the Columbia River, which is normally a natural fire break because it's really wide. I don't know if you've ever been to the Columbia River Gorge, but it's a huge gorge. I was astonished that the river was able to jump that the fire was able to jump that. People in Oregon and Washington were reporting ash falling from the forest fires, similar to what happened at the Mount St. Helens volcanic eruption. It's just this rain of ash. So terrible natural disasters up there. And then you probably started studying here at the beginning of September on a day not unlike today, right? But it was 106 in San Francisco, where the average usual summer temperature is 70 degrees. So bizarre. I've lived in the Bay Area for 20 years, and that was completely shocking. So the last record was 103, set in June 2000. This was the all-time temperature high on September 1st, 106 in San Francisco. When the next day it was 102, that was only the 3rd time since 1874 that the city had seen 2 back-to-back days over 100. And this was the all-time heat record for San Francisco. So all over, things are really weird lately. And so that's why I say at this moment it's really important to study the Ecozoic, figure out some pathways towards it, as some of you have suggested, figure out how we communicate it, figure out how art can express what we might hope to see, what we might want to see, rather than what we're afraid of or what is happening right now. And it's important to understand what is happening right now also. It's important to communicate that and and get the level of weirdness, the level of just totally extreme weirdness. One other thing that I should mention, flooding all around the globe. I think in the US, I mean, I know I have been very distracted by domestic news in the US, but terrible flooding in India and Bangladesh, a third of Bangladesh underwater, more than 1,000 people died, also flooding in Africa. So we're seeing these fires, hurricanes, flooding, precipitation when we don't expect it, more intense precipitation than expected, or drought and more dryness than expected. So again, very weird weather situations. And the reason this is important is a few different reasons. One, humanity evolved and developed into Homo sapiens sapiens during a period of pretty even and reliable weather over the last 10,000 years. So we have been a species that has been used to predictable weather. You have the cycle for planting, the seasons, and you look for the signs of the birds returning or the flowers leafing, and then farmers know it's time to plant. We depend on agriculture. We're heavily dependent on agriculture, which depends on predictable seasons, predictable rainfall for harvest and planting. So that's one, just sort of the foundation of society, really rests on predictable seasons. And another reason that this is really significant is that these so-called natural disasters have disproportionate impacts depending on socioeconomic class and race in particular. And so very often, as we saw in Hurricane Katrina, for example, communities that were least able to handle environmental harms because they were low income, they didn't have a lot of resources, or they weren't socially connected, or were dealing with a lot of racism, actually experienced the worst environmental harms and were the least able to recover from them. And again, we're seeing this around the world, not just in the US, but when we think of a third of Bangladesh being underwater, that's a really poor country, right? And there already people are living in very simple houses or shacks without a lot of capacity to absorb extra shocks to their system, and now they're being asked to deal with tremendous floods. So issues of social justice, which a couple of you mentioned, and of course this is incredibly alive in our country right now. And I think that there's no way of separating right now issues of social justice and politics and environmental justice and climate change, which I was very purposely leading up to very slowly, because last year I got some pushback. But I wanted to paint the picture of what is happening. I think at this point in time, climate change is not a sort of future thing that's going to happen. It's happening now. And we're experiencing, I'm boiling up here, we're experiencing it right now. This is not a normal thing in San Francisco. And so there are a lot of questions about how do we respond, how do we make sense of it, what do we do? Climate change is really hard to get a grip on politically, ethically, socially, morally, because it's such a diffuse problem. I just named 4 categories of weather weirding that are happening, and they're all related to climate change. They have different connections to climate change, but they're all a consequence. But if you just look at that set of 4 different weather weirdings, it's hard to even say, well, what is climate change? So I'd say that is one reason that it's been hard for our governments and political systems and scientists to be able to take direct action. Timothy Morton, a literary theorist, has termed climate change as a hyper-object because it's so diffuse and so difficult to get a grip on. It sort of transcends the category of object. And so into this space of a hyper-object, a diffuse justice challenge, a diffuse global challenge, I think religions have a special role to play, a particular role to play, and that they're really called forward to stand up at this time. Religions teach about morality. Different religions have different takes on it, but religions have historically been bastions of promulgating some kind of morality to their followers. So that's one reason that I think religion has a significant role to play. Another reason is just that religions are organized groups of people. And to get a handle on some of the challenges facing both our country and our world at this moment, we need organized groups of people. So it's a very sort of practical angle on religions. But as Mary Evelyn Tucker says, like, religions are where the people are. The people go to their congregations or their houses of worship. That's where they meet together. So that's another reason. And also, as you may have read in the Lynn White article, some people think religions bear a burden for some of the situations that we find ourselves in. And this is highly, highly debatable. But I'm not saying that religions are a panacea. I'm saying that we need to look at the role of religions in environmental degradation. And so Lynn White says, he was a historian at UCLA. He wrote his piece in 1967 in Science. He said that Christianity is what he called the most anthropocentric religion the world has ever seen. He said because Christianity really highlights the human being, then it devalues the rest of the natural world, and therefore it creates what he called a mood of indifference toward the natural world, and gave license to use the material of the natural world just as so much stuff, not as anything with sentience or value or agency. So that was Lynn White's critique, and like I said, it's hugely debated, but we need to look at the role of religions in creating environmental crises as well as in addressing them. So I think that I want to point out 4 temporal aspects of religions engaging with environmental issues. In other words, when should religions engage with environmental issues? And so we can look at the anticipatory or preventive phase, like we think something bad is going to happen, we think we should do something about it before something actually happens. This is where in Christianity it's called the prophetic voice, where someone like Martin Luther King would call upon us to act better or act differently. Or Thomas Berry, in the words that I read you earlier, is engaging with the prophetic voice and saying, we are called to a better future. We can do better than this. So we see quite a lot of that. Thomas Berry, Pope Francis, with his encyclical Laudato Si 2 summers ago, took a very prophetic stance, and he said, on care for our common home, we have to do better, basically. We have to understand how environmental degradation, social justice, and economic issues are interrelated, and we have to look at all of those together. And just last week, he launched another grenade, I have to say. I mean, he was very, very harsh about people denying climate change right in the midst of all these hurricanes. And he said, history will judge climate change deniers. So this is the prophetic voice saying, like, repent now. But calling us to do better, calling us to understand the social justice, disparate social justice impacts of these weather weirding disasters and address them for the people who need to be supported better by our society and need to not bear the burdens of these changes. And Pope Francis said, if someone is doubtful that this is true, being climate change, they should ask the scientists. Then each person can decide, and history will judge the decisions. So he has been very outspoken that there is a moral role in addressing climate change, that religions have this moral obligation to address climate change, and particularly to speak up for the poor and the people who are left behind in this economic development of society. He said, all of us have a responsibility, all of us, small or large, a moral responsibility. We have to take it seriously. We can't joke some of us have their own. Even politicians have their own. Some Scientists' opinions are not made on the fly. They are very clear. Let each person decide, and history will judge. So he's really employing that prophetic voice. Other people who have engaged the prophetic voice in an anticipatory way, talking about environmental degradation and environmental justice, include the Dalai Lama, the Karmapa. There's a great article by the Karmapa, who's like the third highest Buddhist leader in Asia, walking the path of green compassion, I think. And he talks about how environmental concern is resonant with Tibetan Buddhism and how that's an obligation of Tibetan Buddhists. And to some degree, the Forum on Religion and Ecology is engaging the prophetic voice too. So I said I'd say more about it. The Forum on Religion and Ecology is based at Yale. It's a website and a network of scholars with a huge compendium of books and articles and bibliographies and news articles, all dealing with the intersection of religion and ecology. So if there's anything that I say today that you want to follow up on, I bet you could find it at the Forum on Religion and Ecology. I was going to write down the website. Do I have it right here? But anyway, if you Google the Forum on Religion and Ecology, you'll get it right there. And like I said, they track news articles, and so they've had a lot of the news articles on Pope Francis, for example, speaking out on climate change. They also have upcoming events in this broad field of religion and ecology, conferences, workshops, job opportunities, new publications, curriculum, syllabi. So it's really a kind of a clearinghouse and a great resource for delving into different areas. They also have statements by leaders in the different world religious traditions talking about how their religious tradition engages with issues of ecology and environmental degradation. So I said there were four temporal aspects to speaking out about environmental degradation. After anticipation, or the prophetic voice, I think the next is the response. If an environmental catastrophe happens, how the religions respond. And again, we see a range. Religions don't respond with one voice or on one note, but in Texas, for example, we're seeing churches be leaders in helping people clean up and collect donations for people who have been flooded out, things like that. So that's a sort of direct response to an environmental disaster. The social justice work and the racial justice work are really direct responses to environmental catastrophe. And then we're seeing some environmental education at houses of worship. So houses of worship and congregations are saying that to be a full follower of this religion, you should know something about the larger world and the way that humans have impacts on the rest of the world, and some environmental issues, basic eco-literacy. That's the sort of response we're seeing. Interfaith Power and Light, which is based right here in San Francisco and now has spread all around the country, is a nonprofit organization that works with faith communities to decrease their energy usage and adopt greener energy sources. So that's a way where an organization is helping religion, a particular religious tradition, identify what within that tradition connects with environmental concern and how to practice and live out that environmental concern in their practices. So it could be through reducing energy usage, putting solar panels up, adopting clean energy, things like that. Another kind of response we're seeing is an organization called Green Faith that is helping houses of worship just green themselves in general and consider their energy footprint. For example, consider commuting, consider what kinds of furnishings and materials they use in their house of worship, and how to choose greener options. So that's the response. Like, if we see environmental degradation happening, or if we see an environmental catastrophe happening, sometimes we see these kind of responses from religions. Then a third way of response, or third temporal response, is mitigation. So after something happens, what can you do to lessen it? And I'm actually not seeing so much from the religions here. People particularly talk about mitigation with relation to climate change. As it gets hotter, or as weather gets weirder, what are some ways to help people to decrease the harms of that? And like I said, I'm not seeing as much about sort of harm reduction, but I think that's an area that religions can step into more. Interfaith Power and Light is doing that some by trying to help houses of worship adopt greener energy choices. And also the Green Seminary Initiative is trying to train leaders of faith communities to incorporate environmental issues into their teaching and leadership. But again, I'm not seeing as much in the mitigation area. And then the fourth one is adaptation. And again, we hear a lot about this with relation to climate change. As weather gets weirder, as places get hotter or drier or wetter, how can we help people adapt in those areas? What do people need to do to adapt? And this is where I think that religions have a particular and sort of poignant role to play, because for many people, religions are very comforting. And so maybe that is one aspect that will help people adapt in whatever kind of beliefs they have about a higher power or God or the future or the spirit or the universe. That may provide some internal strength as conditions become very difficult. So I think that that's an important way that religions and spiritualities engage with climate change and environmental degradation. But again, I'm not seeing as many specific responses from religious communities. I think it's another area that we need to think about, and I hope I'll see more work in the future. Let me see. So in a few minutes before, so it was anticipation, response, mitigation, and adaptation. Yeah. And obviously, anticipation is probably the most powerful. If you can prevent something before it happens, then much better than having to adapt later on. But I think we're dealing with all of these now, because we are having to adapt to a more weather unstable world, and in a hotter world or a wetter world or drier world, and how do we do that? So I think in the final few minutes here, just want to point out some of the threads that have fed in to this area that's called religion and ecology now. And I suspect from what you've said about your backgrounds and just the fact that you've come to PCC, that you might have affinity to one or another of these threads, and just might ring some bells. So I want to, show you all the people who are coming to this party, basically. So one stream or one thread is process philosophy. Alfred North Whitehead, John Cobb wrote Is It Too Late? A Theology of Ecology way back in 1971. And John Cobb, he's amazing. He's still teaching. He's 90-something. Totally incredible. So that's one stream, process philosophy, which in a very brief nutshell says that everything's in process, that is the nature of nature, or the nature of the universe, is that everything's going on as a process, not that you have this thing and that other thing, but that we're all processes. And vast volumes have been written about that. So that is not the be-all and end-all of process philosophy, but just a tiny bit.
We just want the interiority all the way down.
Thanks. Yeah, interiority all the way down, right, which we've kind of been hitting on, yeah. Another stream that we can see is ecofeminist theology. And so we had Rosemary Radford Ruther, a major ecofeminist theologian who sadly suffered a stroke last spring and doesn't appear to be able to work anymore, but is okay. But she wrote New Woman, New Earth in 1975, really groundbreaking as a feminist theologian. Mary Daly writing Gynecology in 1978. Carolyn Merchant, a mentor of mine, wrote The Death of Nature in 1980. So one of the exciting projects I'm working on right now is a volume analyzing the contributions of Carolyn Merchant's work to the environmental humanities and environmental fields more broadly. She's an environmental historian, but she's also an ecofeminist, and also has written on philosophy and ethics, has definitely contributed to religion and ecology. And so we've got 17, I think, essays from people in environmental philosophy and ethics, ecofeminism, religion and ecology, and environmental history, reflecting on how they've worked with the ideas that Carolyn Merchant has developed and how they've carried them forward. And we're wrapping it up right now. It's going to the press in a couple weeks, so super exciting. Should be out in the spring. But so I'm really steeped in Carolyn Merchant's work right now. So if there's anything you want to talk about Carolyn Merchant, if you know her at all, then that's a lot of where my thinking is right now. Catherine Keller's From a Broken Web in 1986, and Sally McFaig, another feminist theologian. And then also eco-theologians who didn't necessarily bring in the feminist aspect, but Cal DeWitt, Sally McFaig, Thomas Berry, who I've mentioned, Teilhard de Chardin, a definite strong lineage in PCC. Lynn White's The Historical Roots of Our Ecological Crisis, which you read. There was a report in 1987 from the United Church of Christ, a Protestant denomination in the US, called Toxic Waste and Race in the United States. And 1987, quite a while ago. It was a groundbreaking work. Their analysis showed that toxic waste facilities and communities of color totally overlapped on the map. And that was the first time that sort of spatial analysis had shown that toxic waste facilities and communities of colors were correlated, and that we had these sort of disproportionate impacts on communities of color. So that came out of the United Church of Christ, which is kind of interesting. It didn't come from a policy think tank or whatever, but out of the UCC's social justice mission, they wanted to bring about and continue to want to bring about greater social justice. Then another stream we have is environmental ethicists. J. Baird Callicott did some of the earliest work in environmental ethics. He's contributing to our volume, and he has a fantastic piece. Christopher Stone, a lawyer, wrote an essay in questioning, should trees have legal standing, and how would that affect the legal framework? And so that's a really early statement about the personhood of non-human persons. Really interesting essay. Holmes Ralston was another early environmental ethicist, philosophy gone wild. And Baird Callicott is a big interpreter of Aldo Leopold's land ethic. Thank you. That's so weird. Yeah, of Aldo Leopold's land ethic, which in basically he said a thing is right when it tends to preserve the stability, beauty, and integrity of the land, and it is wrong otherwise. But that's such a short statement, so Baird Callicott has spent much of his career unpacking it, expanding it, seeing how we can incorporate that into a broader ethical framework. And then just two more streams that are leading in, and you may well think of other ones too. Sustainable development is another theme, more from the sort of policy-oriented and technocratic stream. So even the concept of sustainable development that was developed in the 80s in Our Common Future, in the Earth Summit in Rio in 1992. So this idea that we could provide a more luxurious material standard of living development for everyone on Earth, and it could be sustainable. It would not harm the future possibility of the Earth to provide for humans and non-human beings, which has, of course, been questioned subsequently. But that idea of sustainable development. And then the final stream I want to bring in is conservation biology. I mentioned Aldo Leopold. He's known as really the founder of conservation biology and wildlife biology. Wrote the Sand County Almanac, which is a really beautiful, accessible book. It'd be great summer reading if you haven't read it. He had a piece of land. He taught at the University of Wisconsin for many years, and he had a piece of land not too far outside of Madison, and when he bought it, it was totally degraded, dry, dusty, and he started planting trees and bringing water and trying to rehabilitate the land, and did over many years, and so developed concepts of restoration ecology through his work on the land, and wrote a Sand County Almanac as he was restoring that land. So, but it's very poetic. He's a beautiful writer, and just sort of takes you through the seasons of the year on that piece of land. And within conservation biology, biodiversity conservation, trying to maintain the richness of wild species on the earth. That's been a subset of conservation biology in the last 30 years probably. And biophilia, this idea that humans are innately attracted towards life and lifelike processes. The idea was developed by E.O. Wilson, the famous Harvard biologist, and Stephen Keller, who was a mentor of mine and passed away last winter very suddenly. I was very sad. But so I have to bring him in. So this idea that people innately love life, like other beings and other creatures. And I think that kind of brings us back around to Thomas Berry and what he was saying, that we need this household of life. We need to embrace this household of life on planet Earth, and we need to move toward an ecozoic era in which we can do that. So I think I'll leave it there. Thank you for your attention.